The Lighthouse Keeper's Dream. Chapter 1: The Storm. The wind howled across the rocky cliffs of Thornwick Point, carrying with it the salt spray of an angry sea. Thomas Whitmore stood at the top of the old lighthouse, his weathered hands gripping the iron railing as he watched the storm clouds gather on the horizon. He had been the keeper of this lighthouse for 30 years, and in all that time, he had never seen a storm approach with such menacing deliberation. The lighthouse itself was a relic from another era, a towering structure of white stone that had guided ships safely through these treacherous waters for over a century. Its light had never failed, not once, and Thomas took immense pride in that fact. It was more than just his job. It was his calling, his purpose, his reason for being. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Thomas made his way down the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the hollow interior. The stairs were worn smooth by generations of keepers before him, each step a testament to the countless times someone had climbed up and down, tending to the light that meant life or death for sailors navigating these dangerous shores. At the bottom of the lighthouse, in the small cottage that served as his home, Thomas found his tea still warm on the table. He had left it there only minutes before, but already it seemed like a lifetime ago. The storm was coming faster than he had anticipated. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air pressure changed, in the peculiar stillness that preceded the chaos. Thomas was a man of routine. Every morning, he rose at dawn to check the light mechanism, polish the lens, and make any necessary repairs. He kept meticulous logs of weather conditions, passing ships, and the state of the equipment. In the evenings, he would sit by his small fireplace and read from his extensive collection of books. Histories, novels, poetry, whatever he could get his hands on during his monthly trips to the mainland. But tonight would be different. Tonight, he would need to stay vigilant. The cottage was modest but comfortable. A single room served as his kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a small bedroom tucked into the back. The walls were lined with shelves holding not just books but also trinkets from his years at sea before he became a keeper. There was a brass sextant, a ship's compass, a collection of beautiful seashells, and photographs of ships he had served on in his youth. One photograph in particular held a place of honor on the mantelpiece. It showed a young Thomas, barely 20 years old, standing on the deck of the merchant vessel Celestial Star, with his arm around a beautiful young woman with dark curling hair and eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the faded black and white image. Eleanor. His Eleanor. Thomas picked up the photograph, his thumb gently brushing across her face. It had been 10 years since she passed, taken by an illness that had swept through the coastal towns like a cruel tide. They had never had children, though they had wanted them desperately. Instead, they had filled their lives with each other, with laughter and adventures and quiet moments of perfect contentment. When she died, something in Thomas had died too. He had retreated to this lighthouse, to this solitary existence, because the world without Eleanor seemed too vast, too empty, too painful to navigate. Here, in the lighthouse, he had a purpose. He saved lives. He mattered. And in the long, lonely nights, he could almost feel her presence beside him, could almost hear her voice in the wind, could almost smell her lavender perfume in the salt air. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the cottage, pulling Thomas from his reverie. He carefully returned the photograph to its place and made his way to the window. The storm had arrived. Rain lashed against the glass with such force that Thomas could barely see the waves crashing against the rocks below. The wind had risen to a roar, and he could feel the whole lighthouse trembling under its assault. But the light was still turning, still shining, still doing its job. That was all that mattered. Thomas pulled on his heavy oilskin coat and hat, preparing to make the journey back up to check the light. It was unnecessary. The mechanism was sound, and the light would continue to burn. But he couldn't help himself. He needed to see it with his own eyes, needed to be sure. The climb up the stairs in the middle of the storm was treacherous. The wind seemed to find every crack and crevice in the lighthouse walls, creating eerie whistling sounds that echoed up and down the stairwell. The lighthouse swayed ever so slightly, a movement that would have been imperceptible on a calm day but was all too noticeable now. When Thomas finally reached the lamp room at the top, he was breathless. But the sight that greeted him made it all worthwhile. The great Fresnel lens was spinning smoothly, its beam cutting through the darkness and rain like a sword through silk. Out there in the storm, somewhere, sailors would see that light and know they were near the rocks. They would be able to steer clear, to find safe passage, to return home to their families. Thomas stood there for a long moment, watching the light, feeling a sense of peace wash over him despite the chaos raging outside. This was why he was here. This was his purpose. But then, something caught his eye. Out in the storm, barely visible through the sheets of rain, was a light that shouldn't be there. A ship's light, flickering and dim, far too close to the rocks. Thomas's heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed his telescope and trained it on the light, wiping the rain from the lens again and again as he tried to get a clear view. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was a small fishing vessel, maybe 40 feet long, being tossed about by the waves like a toy. Thomas could see figures on deck, silhouettes against the lightning flashes, struggling with the sails and rigging. They were in serious trouble. The boat was being driven inexorably toward the rocks, a maze of sharp, unforgiving stone that had claimed countless vessels over the years. If they hit those rocks, the boat would be torn apart in seconds, and everyone aboard would be thrown into the churning sea. Thomas had to do something. But what? He was just one man, in a lighthouse with no way to reach them. The lifeboat station was 3 miles down the coast, and by the time he could raise the alarm and get them launched, it would be too late. He ran down the stairs, his mind racing. There had to be something he could do. In the cottage, he found his old signal flares, kept for emergencies just like this. He grabbed them and raced back up the lighthouse, his lungs burning with the effort. At the top, he stepped out onto the gallery that circled the lamp room. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, and the rain felt like needles against his face. But he managed to light the first flare and hold it high above his head, waving it back and forth in the universal signal for danger. Through the telescope, he watched the fishing boat. Had they seen him? Did they understand? For agonizing seconds, nothing changed. The boat continued its fatal course toward the rocks. Then suddenly the boat began to turn. Someone aboard had seen the flares, had understood the warning. Thomas could see them fighting with the wheel, fighting with the sails, fighting with every ounce of strength they had to pull the boat away from the rocks. Thomas lit another flare, then another, creating a blazing trail in the sky to show them the safe passage. The fishing boat was responding, turning more sharply now, its bow pointing away from the rocks and toward the deeper water beyond the reef. It was going to be close. Thomas held his breath as the boat came within yards of the nearest outcropping, so close that he was certain it would hit. But at the last possible moment, a large wave lifted the boat and pushed it past the danger, out into the relative safety of the open water. Thomas collapsed against the lighthouse railing, his heart pounding, his breath coming in great gasps. They had made it. The fishing boat was now heading south, away from the rocks, toward the sheltered harbor at Maryvale. They would make it. They were safe. As the adrenaline began to fade, Thomas felt the exhaustion wash over him. He was soaking wet, chilled to the bone, and shaking from the combination of cold and spent energy. He made his way back down to the cottage, leaving a trail of water on the stairs behind him. In the cottage, He stripped off his wet clothes and changed into dry ones, then made himself a cup of hot tea with trembling hands. He sat by the fireplace, feeding it logs until a good blaze was going, and slowly began to warm up. The storm continued to rage outside, but Thomas felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had done his job. The lighthouse had done its job. Somewhere out there, a group of fishermen would be going home to their families because the light had warned them, and because an old lighthouse keeper had been paying attention. Thomas picked up the photograph of Eleanor again. "We saved them, love," he whispered to her image, "just like old times." He could almost hear her voice in reply, "I'm proud of you, Thomas. I'm always proud of you." Chapter 2: The Visitor. The storm raged for 3 days. For 3 days, Thomas remained vigilant, climbing the stairs every few hours to check the light, to scan the horizon for ships in distress, to make sure everything was functioning as it should. He barely slept, taking only brief naps in his chair by the fire, always with one ear listening for any change in the wind or the sound of the mechanism above. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Thomas woke from a fitful doze to find sunlight streaming through his windows, golden and warm and impossibly beautiful after days of darkness. The sea, which had been a churning cauldron of fury, was now as smooth as glass, reflecting the blue sky like a mirror. Thomas stood at his window for a long moment, simply marveling at the transformation. It was as if the world had been reborn, washed clean by the storm. The rocks below the lighthouse gleamed wetly in the sun, and seabirds that had been absent during the storm were now back, crying and wheeling in the clear air. After a quick breakfast, Thomas decided to make his rounds outside. The storm would have brought debris ashore, and he needed to check that nothing had damaged the lighthouse or the surrounding buildings. He pulled on his boots and coat, lighter now without the oilskin, and stepped outside. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. Thomas walked around the base of the lighthouse, checking the foundation, the walls, the door. Everything seemed intact. The lighthouse had withstood yet another assault from the elements, as it had been doing for over 100 years. As he made his way toward the small boathouse where he kept his supplies, Thomas noticed something unusual on the beach below the cliffs. There was something there, something that hadn't been there before the storm. It looked like wreckage, pieces of wood, perhaps part of a boat. Thomas made his way carefully down the narrow path that zigzagged down the cliff face. It was a treacherous descent even on the best of days, and after the storm it was even more dangerous. Loose rocks and slick mud made every step uncertain. But Thomas had made this journey thousands of times, and his feet knew the way. At the bottom he found what he had seen from above, debris from a ship. But it wasn't from the fishing boat he had saved. This was older wreckage, probably churned up from the sea floor by the violent waves. There were pieces of hull, some rope, a broken mast, and various other fragments that had once been part of a vessel. As Thomas was examining the debris, something else caught his eye. Further down the beach, near the tide line, there was a dark shape that didn't look like wreckage. It looked like a person. Thomas's heart began to race as he hurried across the sand. As he got closer, he could see that it was indeed a person. A young woman, lying face down in the sand, her long dark hair spread around her like a veil. She was wearing a simple white dress that was torn and soaked through. Miss, can you hear me?" Thomas called as he ran the last few yards. He dropped to his knees beside her and gently turned her over, checking for signs of life. She was alive. Her skin was cold, but he could feel a pulse at her throat, weak but steady. She was breathing, though shallowly. Thomas quickly assessed her for injuries. There was a nasty gash on her forehead, and various cuts and bruises on her arms and legs. but nothing that appeared life-threatening. Without hesitation, Thomas scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and began the difficult climb back up the cliff path. She moaned softly as he carried her head lolling against his chest, but she didn't wake. By the time Thomas reached the cottage, he was breathing hard and his arms were aching, but he didn't pause. He carried the young woman inside and laid her gently on his bed, then immediately went to work. He had basic medical training, all lighthouse keepers did, and he had treated his share of injuries over the years. First, he covered her with every blanket he had, trying to raise her body temperature. Then he cleaned and bandaged the wound on her forehead and tended to her other injuries. She remained unconscious throughout, occasionally mumbling words that Thomas couldn't make out. As he worked, Thomas found himself studying her face. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with delicate features and pale skin. Even in her current state, there was something striking about her, something that seemed almost ethereal. Who was she? Where had she come from? Had she been on one of the ships that passed during the storm? Once Thomas had done all he could medically, he pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down to wait. Could be hours before she woke, or even longer. In the meantime, all he could do was watch over her and hope that her injuries weren't more serious than they appeared. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas dozed in his chair. He was exhausted from his days of vigilance during the storm, and now that the immediate crisis was over, his body was demanding rest. But he didn't let himself sleep deeply. Part of him remained alert, listening for any change in the young woman's breathing, ready to respond if she needed him. It was late afternoon when she finally stirred. Thomas, who had been reading a book, looked up immediately at the sound of her movement. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a remarkable shade of green, he noticed, and she looked around in confusion. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're safe," Thomas said gently, setting his book aside. "You're at Thornwick Point Lighthouse. I'm Thomas Whitmore, the keeper. I found you on the beach this morning." She tried to sit up, then winced and fell back against the pillows. "My head. You have a nasty bump there," Thomas said. "You should rest. Can you tell me your name? Do you remember what happened?" The young woman closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. "My name is Isla Gray." She opened her eyes again, looking at Thomas with an expression of distress. "I was on a ship. There was a storm. I don't remember anything after that. Just water. So much water." "It's all right," Thomas said soothingly. "You're safe now. That's all that matters. Do you remember the name of the ship?" Isla shook her head, then immediately regretted it, judging by the grimace of pain that crossed her face. "No, I can't remember. It's all so foggy." "That's not uncommon with head injuries," Thomas assured her. "Your memory will likely come back in time. For now, you need to rest and recover. Are you in pain? Do you feel any injuries other than your head?" "Everything hurts," Isla admitted with a weak smile. "But nothing feels broken. How long was I?" "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "I found you this morning, after the storm passed. You were unconscious. It's possible you were in the water for quite some time." Isla looked down at herself, seeming to notice for the first time that she was in a strange bed, covered with blankets, and wearing a bandage on her head. You saved my life." Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "I did what anyone would have done. Now you must be hungry. Let me make you something to eat. Can you manage some soup?" "That sounds wonderful," Isla said gratefully. Thomas went to his small kitchen area and began preparing a simple vegetable soup. As he worked, He was acutely aware of Isla's presence in his cottage, in his bed. It had been so long since anyone else had been here, so long since he had spoken to another person beyond his monthly trips to the mainland for supplies. The cottage suddenly felt smaller, but also warmer, more alive. When the soup was ready, Thomas helped Isla sit up and placed a tray across her lap. She ate slowly, carefully, but with obvious appetite. Color began to return to her cheeks, and she looked a bit stronger. "This is delicious," she said between spoonfuls. "Thank you. You're very kind." "It's just vegetable soup," Thomas said, embarrassed by the praise. "Nothing special." "It's special to me," Isla said firmly. "Mr. Whitmore." "Thomas, please." "Thomas, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life, you tended my injuries, you're feeding me. I'm in your debt." "You owe me nothing," Thomas said. "But you should know, I'll need to report your rescue to the authorities. They'll want to know about any survivors from the storm. Is there anyone I should contact? Family? Friends?" A shadow passed over Isla's face. I don't think so. I was traveling alone. My parents passed away years ago, and I have no siblings. I was on that ship because I was looking for a new start, a new life. I suppose I got one, just not in the way I expected. Thomas felt a pang of sympathy for this young woman who seemed as alone in the world as he was. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're well enough to travel. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." "I don't want to impose," Isla protested. "It's no imposition," Thomas assured her. "In fact, it's nice to have company. It gets lonely here sometimes." Isla smiled at him, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, some long-frozen part of him beginning to thaw. "Then I accept gratefully." "Thank you, Thomas." Chapter 3: Days of Healing. The days that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Isla's physical injuries healed quickly under Thomas's careful ministering, but her memory of the shipwreck remained frustratingly vague. She could remember her life before the storm, her childhood in a small village, her parents' death, her decision to seek a new life in America. But the details of the ship and the wreck itself remained elusive, like trying to grasp smoke. Thomas gave Isla his bed and made himself a makeshift sleeping area in the main room of the cottage. He protested at first, insisting that she should take the more comfortable spot, but Isla was firm in her refusal to displace him any more than she already had. During the day, while Thomas went about his duties maintaining the lighthouse, Isla would rest, read from his extensive book collection, or sit by the window and watch the sea. Thomas found himself hurrying through his tasks, eager to return to the cottage and her company. They would eat their meals together, and in the evenings they would sit by the fire and talk. Thomas, who had spoken to no one but himself for months on end, found himself opening up to Isla in ways he never expected. He told her about his years at sea, about his decision to become a lighthouse keeper, and eventually haltingly about Eleanor. "She sounds like a wonderful woman," Isla said softly when Thomas finished telling her about his late wife. "She was," Thomas agreed, staring into the fire, "the best person I've ever known. When she died, I thought I would die too. Part of me did die, I think. The part that knew how to live in the world, how to connect with people, how to feel joy. I came here because I couldn't bear to be around others, around life, when she was gone." "But you saved lives," Isla pointed out. "Every time your light guides a ship safely through these waters, you're living. You're making a difference." "I suppose," Thomas said. "But it's not the same as really living, is it? It's more like existing, going through the motions." "Maybe," Isla said. "Or maybe it's a different kind of living, quieter kind. That doesn't make it less valuable." Thomas looked at her, at this young woman who had appeared so suddenly in his life, who was now sitting in Eleanor's chair by his fire, and felt that thawing sensation again, stronger this time. "You're very wise for someone so young." Isla laughed. "I'm not that young. I'm 28, and I'm not wise at all. If I were wise, I wouldn't have ended up nearly drowning in a shipwreck." "You had no control over the storm," Thomas said. "No, but I had control over my decision to board that ship in the first place. I was running away, Thomas, from my old life, from my memories, from the expectations of the small village where everyone knew me as the orphaned gray girl. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I could become someone new, someone without a past." "And now?" Thomas asked. Isla smiled sadly. "Now I find myself washed up on a beach with no memory of the shipwreck and nowhere to go. Perhaps the universe is telling me something." "What do you think it's telling you?" "I'm not sure yet," Isla admitted. "But I'm starting to think that maybe running away wasn't the answer. Maybe what I needed was to find a place where I could stop running." As the days turned into weeks, Isla grew stronger. She began helping Thomas with small tasks around the cottage, cooking, cleaning, organizing his books. Thomas protested at first, saying she was his guest and shouldn't feel obligated to work. But Isla insisted. She needed to feel useful, she said, needed to feel like she was contributing something. Thomas found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't in years. He would wake early, as always, to tend to the light, but now he would hurry back to the cottage to find Isla already awake, making breakfast, humming softly to herself. They would eat together, talking about everything and nothing, the weather, the books they were reading, their dreams for the future. Isla proved to be an excellent cook, far better than Thomas. She had a way of turning his simple ingredients into meals that were both delicious and beautiful. Thomas found himself actually looking forward to mealtimes, something that hadn't been true in years. One morning, about 3 weeks after Isla's arrival, Thomas woke to find her standing at the window, looking out at the sea. Her injuries had healed completely, leaving only a small scar on her forehead that she said gave her character. She was wearing one of the simple dresses that Thomas had purchased for her on his last trip to the mainland, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid. "Good morning," Thomas said, joining her at the window. "Good morning," Isla replied, but she didn't turn to look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. Isla was quiet for a long moment. "I'm thinking that I should probably leave soon. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Thomas felt his heart sink. He had known this moment was coming, of course. Isla couldn't stay here forever. But the thought of the cottage being empty again, of returning to his solitary existence, filled him with dread. "You're not imposing," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like." "That's kind of you," Isla said, finally turning to look at him. "But I need to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. I can't hide away in a lighthouse forever, no matter how tempting that might be." "Is that what you think you're doing? Hiding?" "Aren't I?" Isla asked. "Aren't we both?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas didn't know how to answer it because he suspected she was right. They were both hiding him from his grief, her from her past and her uncertain future. "Would it be so bad?" Thomas asked quietly. "To stay here? To make a life here?" Isla looked at him searchingly. "Thomas, what are you saying?" Thomas realized, with a start, that he didn't entirely know what he was saying. All he knew was that the thought of Isla leaving, of never seeing her again, was unbearable. "I'm saying that I've enjoyed having you here, more than enjoyed it. You've brought life back to this place, back to me. When you leave, it will be empty again." I will be empty again. Thomas, Isla began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I know I'm just an old lighthouse keeper. I know I have nothing to offer you but this solitary life, this isolated existence. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to make this your home too, I would be honored. I would be grateful. I would do everything in my power to make you happy. Isla's eyes were shining with unshed tears. You're not old, she said, and you have more to offer than you think. You've given me shelter, safety, kindness, and friendship when I had nothing and no one. You've shown me that it's possible to build a meaningful life even in solitude, even after tremendous loss. That's no small thing. Then stay, Thomas said simply. I want to, Isla admitted. More than you know. But Thomas, you need to be sure. You need to be sure that you're not asking me to stay because you're lonely, or because I remind you of Eleanor, or because you don't remind me of Eleanor, Thomas interrupted. You're nothing like her, and I'm not asking you to stay because I'm lonely, though I am. I'm asking you to stay because when I imagine the future now, I can't imagine it without you in it. Because you make me want to really live again, not just exist. Because I hope that maybe we could help each other find our way back to the world. A tear rolled down Isla's cheek. I think we could too, she whispered. And then, without quite knowing how it happened, Thomas found himself holding her, and she was holding him back, and they stood there together in the morning light, two lost souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of places. Chapter 4, The Letter. 3 months after Isla's arrival, Thomas made his monthly trip to the mainland for supplies. Usually, he made this journey alone, but this time Isla accompanied him. It was her first time leaving Thornwick Point since she had washed ashore, and Thomas could see both excitement and nervousness in her eyes as they climbed into his small boat. The journey to Maryvale, the nearest town, took about 2 hours. The sea was calm, and Thomas expertly navigated his boat through the channels between the rocks. Isla sat in the bow, her face turned toward the sun, her hair whipping in the wind. When they reached Maryvale, Thomas tied up the boat at the public dock, and they made their way into town. It was a small fishing village, with narrow streets lined with whitewashed cottages and shops. The smell of fish and salt permeated everything, and seagulls wheeled overhead, crying their eternal complaints. Their first stop was the general store, where Thomas purchased flour, sugar, tea, coffee, and various other supplies. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, was a stout woman in her 60s who had known Thomas for years. "Mr. Whitmore," she exclaimed when she saw him. "Right on schedule, as always. And who is this you've brought with you?" "This is Miss Isla Gray," Thomas said. "She's staying at the lighthouse." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. This was clearly the most interesting thing that had happened in Maryvale in months. "Is that so? Well, Miss Gray, welcome to our little town. Any friend of Mr. Whitmore's is welcome here." While Thomas selected his supplies, Mrs. Patterson engaged Isla in conversation, asking her where she was from and how she had come to be staying at the lighthouse. Isla told a carefully edited version of the truth, that she had survived a shipwreck and Thomas had rescued her. She left out the part about having no memory of the wreck, and she certainly didn't mention that she and Thomas had developed feelings for each other. After the general store, they visited the post office. Thomas rarely received mail. Most months there was nothing for him, but it was part of his routine to check. The postmaster, an ancient man named Mr. Griggs, sorted through the pigeonholes behind his counter and emerged with a single envelope. "Just one today, Mr. Whitmore," he said, handing it over. "Looks official." Thomas glanced at the envelope and felt his stomach drop. It was indeed official from the lighthouse board, bearing their official seal. He tucked it into his coat pocket, deciding to read it later. They spent the rest of the morning in Maryvale, visiting various shops and enjoying the simple pleasure of walking through a town, seeing other people, being part of the world. For Thomas, who had isolated himself for so long, it was strange but not unpleasant. And having Isla by his side made it easier, made it feel less like an ordeal and more like an adventure. They had lunch at the small inn, where they sat by a window overlooking the harbor and ate fish and chips while watching the fishing boats come and go. Isla seemed happy, more relaxed than Thomas had seen her since she arrived. The nervousness she had shown earlier had faded, replaced by a gentle contentment. "I like it here," she said, watching the activity in the harbor. "It's peaceful, simple. It's a good town," Thomas agreed. "Good people. They keep to themselves mostly, which suits me fine." "But you don't come here often," Isla observed. "Just once a month for supplies." "That's all I need," Thomas said with a shrug. "Is it?" Isla asked, looking at him intently. "Or is it that you've convinced yourself that's all you need?" Thomas didn't have an answer for that. It was a question he had been asking himself more and more lately, especially since Isla had come into his life. Had he been living the life he needed, or had he been punishing himself, denying himself connection and community as some kind of penance for outliving Eleanor? After lunch, they loaded their supplies into the boat and began the journey back to Thornwick Point. The return trip was quieter than the outbound journey. Isla seemed lost in thought, and Thomas was preoccupied with the letter in his pocket, wondering what it contained. Back at the lighthouse, after they had unloaded the supplies and put everything away, Thomas finally opened the letter. Isla was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself, and Thomas sat by the fire to read. The letter was brief and to the point. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, this letter is to inform you that the Lighthouse Board has been conducting a review of all lighthouse facilities along the coast. As part of this review, we have determined that Thornwick Point Lighthouse, while historically significant, is no longer essential to maritime navigation. With the advent of modern electronic navigation equipment, most vessels no longer rely on lighthouse beacons for safe passage. Therefore, it is with regret that we must inform you that Thornwick Point Lighthouse will be decommissioned effective 6 months from the date of this letter. You will be provided with a pension for your 30 years of service, and assistance will be offered in securing alternative housing. We thank you for your long and faithful service to the maritime community. Sincerely, Robert Ashworth, Director, Lighthouse Board **. Thomas read the letter 3 times, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Decommissioned. After more than 100 years, Thornwick Point Lighthouse was being shut down, and he, after 30 years of service, was being put out to pasture. "Thomas? Is everything all right?" He looked up to find Isla standing in the doorway, a look of concern on her face. She must have seen something in his expression, some sign of the shock he was feeling. "The lighthouse," he said numbly. "They're closing it down." Isla crossed the room quickly and knelt beside his chair. "What? Who's closing it down?" Thomas handed her the letter. She read it quickly, her frown deepening with each line. When she finished, she looked up at him with dismay. "They can't do this," she said. "This lighthouse has been here for over a century. It saved countless lives." "They can and they are," Thomas said. "Modern navigation equipment. They don't need lighthouses anymore, apparently. But what will you do? Where will you go?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I've never thought about it. I always assumed I would be here until I couldn't be here anymore. Until I died, I suppose." Isla took his hands in hers. "Thomas, listen to me. This might not be as bad as you think. Maybe this is an opportunity, a chance to start over, to build a new life. I don't want a new life, Thomas said bitterly. I want this life. I want my lighthouse. I want my purpose. Your purpose isn't just the lighthouse, Isla said firmly. Your purpose is to help people, to guide them, to keep them safe. You can do that anywhere. You don't need a lighthouse for that. But I don't know how to do anything else, Thomas admitted, and in that moment, he felt very old and very tired. This is all I am. Without the lighthouse, I'm nothing. That's not true, Isla said, her voice intense. You're so much more than your job, Thomas. You're kind and wise and brave. You saved my life. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You taught me that it's possible to find peace even after loss. That's who you are, not some title or position. Thomas looked at her, at this remarkable young woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly, and felt some of his despair begin to lift. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was life beyond the lighthouse after all. What would I do? He asked. Where would I go? Isla corrected. Where would we go? And I don't know the answer to that yet. But we have 6 months to figure it out. Together. You'd come with me? Thomas asked, hardly daring to believe it. Of course I would, Isla said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Did you think I would stay here without you? This lighthouse is just a building, Thomas. You're what makes it a home. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. Tears of gratitude, of relief, of a love he had thought he would never feel again. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not, Isla agreed with a small smile. But you're stuck with me anyway. They sat there together by the fire, holding hands, as the sun set outside and the lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation. For the first time since receiving the letter, Thomas began to think that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. Chapter 5. Plans and Promises. The next few weeks were difficult for Thomas. The reality of the lighthouse's closure weighed on him constantly. He found himself going through his daily routines with a kind of desperate attention, as if by performing them perfectly he could somehow forestall the inevitable. Isla watched him with concern, understanding his grief even if she couldn't entirely share it. She tried to distract him with plans for their future, but Thomas was resistant. He didn't want to think about the future. He wanted to hold on to the present for as long as possible. But Isla was patient and persistent. She began making lists of possibilities, places they could go, things they could do. She spoke of opening a shop in one of the coastal towns, or perhaps moving inland and trying their hand at farming. She even suggested they could travel for a while, see the world before settling down anywhere permanently. Thomas listened to her plans with growing appreciation. It wasn't that he was particularly enthusiastic about any of them. His heart was still too bound to the lighthouse for that. But he appreciated her efforts, her determination to build a future for them both. One evening, about a month after receiving the letter, Isla brought up a subject they had been carefully avoiding: marriage. They were sitting by the fire, as had become their custom. Thomas was reading a book of poetry, and Isla was mending one of his shirts. She set down her sewing and looked at him. Thomas, I need to ask you something. There was something in her tone that made Thomas set down his book and give her his full attention. What is it? When we leave here, when we go out into the world to start our new life, what will we be to each other? How will we present ourselves? Thomas understood what she was really asking. In a small village or town, an unmarried man and woman living together would be subject to scandal and gossip, could make their lives very difficult. What do you want us to be? He asked carefully. Isla met his gaze steadily. I want to be your wife, Thomas, not because of propriety or convenience, but because I love you. I know I'm younger than you. I know we haven't known each other very long. And I know you might feel it's too soon after Eleanor. But I also know what I feel, and I know what I want. Thomas felt his heart begin to race. You love me. Of course I love you, Isla said, as if it were obvious. How could I not? You saved my life, you gave me a home. You showed me what it means to live with purpose and dignity even in solitude. And more than that, you make me laugh. You make me feel safe. You make me want to be the best version of myself. I love you too, Thomas said, the words coming easier than he expected. I have for weeks now, but I didn't dare say it. I thought you might think I was taking advantage of the situation, or that I was trying to replace Eleanor, or that I was just a lonely old man who... You're not old, Isla interrupted firmly. You're 52. That's not old. And you're not trying to replace Eleanor. No one could ever replace her, and I wouldn't want to try. What we have is different, but it's no less real. Then yes, Thomas said. Yes, I want you to be my wife. I want us to face whatever comes next together as husband and wife. Isla's face broke into a radiant smile. Yes, yes, Thomas confirmed, and then they were kissing, and Thomas felt as if he were young again, as if anything were possible, as if the whole world were opening up before him instead of closing down. They decided to marry before leaving the lighthouse. Thomas made inquiries on his next trip to the mainland and discovered that the local vicar would be happy to perform the ceremony. They set a date for 3 weeks hence, which would give them time to make the necessary arrangements. The wedding would be simple, just Thomas, Isla, the vicar, and Mrs. Patterson and her husband as witnesses. They would hold it at the lighthouse itself, in the cottage, with a small celebration afterward. Neither of them wanted anything elaborate. What mattered was the commitment they were making to each other, not the ceremony itself. As the wedding day approached, Thomas found his spirits lifting. Yes, he was losing the lighthouse. Yes, he was facing an uncertain future. But he was gaining something far more valuable. A partner, a companion, a love he had thought was lost to him forever. Isla seemed to glow with happiness. She threw herself into preparing for the wedding, making a dress from fabric she had Thomas purchase in town, arranging for food and wine for the celebration, even picking wildflowers from the cliffs to decorate the cottage. The night before the wedding, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. He stood at the top of the lighthouse, watching the beam rotate, listening to the familiar sounds of the machinery. In a few months, these sounds would stop. The light would go dark. The lighthouse would stand empty, a relic of a bygone age. But he would not be empty. He would have Isla, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Couldn't sleep either? Thomas turned to find Isla standing at the top of the stairs. She was wearing a nightgown and had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill night air. I wanted to say goodbye, Thomas admitted, to the lighthouse, to this life. Isla came to stand beside him. Together, they watched the beam sweep across the dark water. It's beautiful, she said softly. I understand why you love it so much. It's been my whole world for so long, Thomas said. Tomorrow, when we marry, I'll be stepping into a new world with you, and I find that I'm not as frightened as I thought I'd be. I'm frightened enough for both of us, Isla admitted with a small laugh. I have no idea what we're doing, Thomas. We're getting married, leaving our home, starting over with no clear plan. It's terrifying. But we'll do it together, Thomas said, taking her hand. Together, Isla agreed. That makes all the difference. They stood there in the lamp room until dawn began to break, holding hands, watching the light, preparing to say goodbye to one life and hello to another. Chapter 6. The Wedding. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. Thomas woke early, as was his habit, and performed his lighthouse duties one last time as an unmarried man. The routine tasks felt different this morning, charged with significance. This was the last time he would climb these stairs alone. After today, he would be a husband again. The vicar arrived at noon, accompanied by the Pattersons. Mrs. Patterson immediately took charge, helping Isla with her dress and hair while her husband kept Thomas company in the main room of the cottage. "Nervous?" Mr. Patterson asked with a knowing smile. He was a weathered man in his 70s, a retired fisherman who had seen his share of life. "Terrified," Thomas admitted. Mr. Patterson laughed. "That's how you know it's real. I was terrified when I married my Beatrice, and I've been terrified every day since. Terrified of losing her, terrified of disappointing her, terrified of not being worthy of her. But that terror, it keeps you sharp, keeps you appreciating what you have." Thomas nodded, understanding. He had felt that terror with Eleanor too, though he had forgotten it over the years. Now it was back, fresh and new, reminding him that he was alive, that he was taking a risk, that he was choosing to love and be loved despite knowing how much it could hurt to lose that love. When Isla emerged from the bedroom, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. She had made her dress from simple white cotton, but on her it looked elegant, almost ethereal. Her dark hair was swept up, with a few tendrils framing her face, and she carried a small bouquet of the wildflowers she had picked from the cliffs. She was beautiful. "You look," Thomas began, then found he had no words adequate to express what he was feeling. Isla smiled, understanding. "You look very handsome too," she said, taking in his best suit, which he had brushed and pressed with great care that morning. The vicar, a kindly man named Reverend Michaels, positioned them in front of the fireplace. Mrs. Patterson and her husband stood as witnesses. The cottage seemed to hold its breath as the ceremony began. Thomas barely heard the words of the ceremony. He was too focused on Isla, on her eyes meeting his, on the small tremor in her hands as she held his, on the profound sense of rightness he felt standing here with her. When it came time to exchange vows, Thomas spoke from his heart. "Isla, you came into my life when I had given up on living. You reminded me that there is still beauty in the world, still joy to be found, still reasons to hope and dream and love. I promise to cherish you, to protect you, to honor you for all the days of my life. I promise to build a future with you, whatever that future may hold. I promise to love you with everything I am." Isla's eyes were bright with tears as she spoke her own vows. "Thomas, you saved my life, but more than that, you gave me a reason to live. You showed me that it's possible to find home in a person rather than a place. I promise to stand by your side through whatever comes, to love you in sickness and in health, in prosperity and hardship. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your companion. I promise to love you for all my days. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Michaels said. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas leaned in and kissed Isla gently, sweetly, aware of their audience but not caring. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. The celebration that followed was small but joyous. Mrs. Patterson had brought a cake she had baked herself, and Mr. Patterson produced a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. They toasted the happy couple, ate cake, and told stories late into the afternoon. As the sun began to set, the Pattersons and Reverend Michaels took their leave, rowing back to Maryvale in the Pattersons' boat. Thomas and Isla stood on the rocks, waving goodbye, watching until the boat was just a speck on the horizon. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said, trying out her new name, "how does it feel to be married?" It feels right, Isla said, leaning against him. It feels like coming home. That night, they lay together in the bed they would now share, watching the moonlight stream through the window. The lighthouse beams swept overhead every 30 seconds, a reminder of where they were, what they were leaving behind. Thomas, Isla said softly. I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you before now. Thomas felt a flutter of concern at her serious tone. What is it? Isla was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. My memory of the shipwreck is not gone. It never was. Thomas sat up, looking down at her in confusion. What do you mean? I remember everything, Isla said, meeting his gaze. The name of the ship, the Arabella. The storm. The moment the ship broke apart. The hours I spent in the water. All of it. But why would you? Thomas began, then understanding dawned. You were afraid. Afraid that if I knew you had family or friends somewhere, I would insist on returning you to them. No, Isla said softly. There really is no one. That part was true. I lied because... She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. Because I wasn't sure the shipwreck really happened. At least, not the way I remembered it. I don't understand. Isla sat up as well, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Thomas, the ship I was on, the Arabella, it sank 20 years ago. In 1885, I was 8 years old. Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. That's impossible. You're 28. You told me. I know what I told you, Isla interrupted. And as far as I know, it's true. But I also remember being on that ship as a child. I remember my parents being with me. I remember the storm, the ship breaking apart, my mother's hand slipping from mine as we went into the water. I remember drowning. You're not making any sense, Thomas said, though a cold feeling was settling in his stomach. I know, Isla said, and she sounded almost relieved to finally be speaking of this. I've been trying to make sense of it myself. There are two sets of memories in my head, Thomas. Two complete lives. In one, I lived a full life, my parents raised me, and I grew to adulthood before deciding to seek a new life in America. In the other, I drowned at age 8 when the Arabella sank. That's... Thomas didn't know how to finish that sentence. Which is real? I don't know, Isla admitted. Maybe both. Maybe neither. All I know is that I woke up on that beach and you were there and this felt real. You feel real. Our love feels real. Whatever I was before, whatever happened to me, this is what I am now. This is who I choose to be. Thomas's mind was reeling. Was Isla suffering from some kind of delusion brought on by her head injury? Or was there something else at work here, something beyond his understanding? Are you? He hesitated, unsure how to even ask the question. Are you a ghost? Isla laughed, though there were tears on her cheeks. I don't know. Am I? I feel solid enough. I eat, I sleep, I bleed when I'm cut. But sometimes, late at night, I look at my hands in the moonlight and wonder if I'm really here at all. If any of this is really happening. Thomas reached out and took her hands in his. They were warm, real, solid. You're here, he said firmly. I don't care what happened before or how you came to be on that beach. You're here now, and you're my wife, and that's all that matters. You're not frightened? Isla asked. Not disgusted? Of course not, Thomas said. A little confused, perhaps, but not frightened, and certainly not disgusted. Isla, I don't claim to understand everything in this world. I've spent 30 years watching the sea, and it still surprises me. I've seen things out there that I couldn't explain. Lights in the water, ships that disappeared between one wave and the next, strange sounds carried on the wind. The world is full of mysteries. Maybe you're one of them, but that doesn't make you any less real to me, or any less precious. Isla threw her arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for accepting me, mysteries and all." They held each other in the moonlight, and Thomas found that he meant what he said. He didn't understand how Isla had come to be here, didn't understand the impossible memories she carried, but he knew she was real in all the ways that mattered. She was his wife, his love, his future. That was enough. Chapter 7. The Last Light. The remaining months passed more quickly than Thomas would have liked. Each day brought them closer to the lighthouse's decommissioning, and Thomas found himself torn between wanting to savor every moment and wanting the waiting to be over. He and Isla spent their days making plans for their future while also taking time to appreciate the present. They would walk along the cliffs, sit on the rocks and watch the sunset, climb to the top of the lighthouse and look out over the vast expanse of the sea. Thomas told Isla stories of ships he had guided safely through storms, of sailors he had saved, of the countless nights he had stood watch while others slept. Isla listened to every story with rapt attention, and Thomas felt as if he were giving her a piece of his history, a part of himself that would continue even after the lighthouse was dark. They also made practical preparations. Thomas had accepted a position as harbor master in Maryvale, a job that would allow him to remain near the sea and continue working with ships and sailors. It wasn't the same as being a lighthouse keeper, but it was honest work and it would provide for them both. They had found a small cottage to rent in town, a cozy 2-bedroom place with a view of the harbor. Isla had been excited about having more space, about being part of a community, about the possibility of making friends and building a life that extended beyond just the two of them. But as the final day approached, Thomas felt his grief returning with renewed force. This lighthouse had been his purpose, his calling, his home for 30 years. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of himself behind. On the night before the decommissioning, Thomas climbed to the top of the lighthouse one last time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and pink. Soon it would be dark, and the light would come on, as it had every night for over 100 years. But tomorrow night, it would remain dark. Tomorrow night, for the first time in more than a century, this lighthouse would be silent, empty, purposeless. Thomas heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Isla joining him. She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "I wanted to see it one more time," Thomas said. "To remember." They stood in silence as the last of the daylight faded and the automatic mechanism engaged, bringing the lamp to life. The beam began its rotation, sweeping across the water, illuminating the darkness. "It's beautiful," Isla said. "I'll miss it too, you know, this place, this light." "I know," Thomas said, "but it's time. The world is changing. We need to change with it." "Do you really believe that?" Isla asked, looking up at him. Thomas thought about it for a moment. "I'm trying to," he admitted. "Some days are easier than others, but I have you. That makes it bearable." "Thomas, there's something I need to tell you," Isla said, and there was something in her voice that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. "What is it?"
"I'm pregnant."
Thomas stared at her, sure he must have misheard. "What? I'm pregnant," Isla repeated, and now she was smiling, a radiant smile that lit up her face. "About 2 months along, I think. I wasn't sure at first, but now, I'm certain." Thomas felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Joy, fear, wonder, disbelief. "But I thought, I'm 52 years old, Isla. I didn't think." "Apparently you thought wrong," Isla said with a laugh. "We're gonna have a baby, Thomas, a child, a family. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which he realized she was. A baby, he whispered. After all these years, Eleanor and I tried for so long, and it never. I know, Isla said gently, and I'm not trying to replace what you lost. This is new. This is ours. This is the future we're building together. I'm going to be a father, Thomas said, the reality of it beginning to sink in. At my age, I'll be in my 70s when the child is 20. And you'll be wonderful, Isla said firmly. You have so much wisdom, so much experience, so much love to give. This child will be lucky to have you as a father. Thomas kissed the top of her head, overwhelmed with gratitude and love and a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. We need to take care of you, he said. You need to see a doctor. You need to rest. You shouldn't be doing heavy work anymore. Thomas, Isla interrupted with a laugh. I'm pregnant, not an invalid. I'll be fine. We'll be fine. All of us. They stood there together in the lamp room, watching the beam sweep across the water, and Thomas felt something shift inside him. The lighthouse was ending, yes, but something new was beginning. A new chapter, a new purpose, a new life to guide and protect. The next morning, officials from the lighthouse board arrived to officially decommission the lighthouse. They were polite but businesslike, going through the necessary paperwork, inventorying the equipment, preparing to shut down the light permanently. Thomas watched them work with a strange detachment. These men didn't understand what they were taking away. To them, this was just an obsolete facility, a relic being retired. They didn't know the countless lives this lighthouse had saved, the ships it had guided, the light it had cast into the darkness. But Thomas knew, and that would have to be enough. At precisely noon, as specified in the documents, Thomas climbed to the lamp room for the last time in his capacity as keeper. The light was off during the day, as always, but the mechanism continued to run, keeping everything ready for the evening lighting. Thomas stood before the control panel, his hand hovering over the main power switch. This was it, the end. One flip of this switch, and over 100 years of continuous operation would come to an end. Isla was beside him, her hand on his shoulder, lending him strength. The officials waited respectfully at the bottom of the stairs, giving him this private moment. Thank you, Thomas said softly to the lighthouse, to the light, to the decades of service it had provided. Thank you for giving me purpose. Thank you for saving lives. Thank you for being here. Then, with a deep breath, he flipped the switch. The mechanism ground to a halt. The lamp went cold. The lighthouse was officially decommissioned. Thomas and Isla stood there for a long moment in the sudden silence. Then, hand in hand, they descended the stairs for the last time, walking past the officials and out into the bright sunshine of the afternoon. They didn't look back. Chapter 8, New Beginnings. The cottage in Maryvale was smaller than the lighthouse but felt more like a proper home. It had 2 bedrooms, a cozy sitting room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a window overlooking the harbor, and a small garden that Isla immediately began planning to cultivate. Thomas's new position as harbor master kept him busy. He was responsible for managing the harbor traffic, maintaining the docks, assisting vessels with berthing, and ensuring the safety of all maritime operations in and around Maryvale. It was different from lighthouse keeping, more social, more administrative, more connected to the community. But Thomas found, to his surprise, that he didn't entirely hate it. The work allowed him to remain connected to the sea and to ships, which eased the transition. And coming home each evening to Isla, to their cottage, to the life they were building together, made everything worthwhile. Isla bloomed in pregnancy. Despite Thomas's worries, She remained healthy and energetic, throwing herself into making their cottage a home. She planted flowers in the garden, hung curtains in the windows, and slowly filled the rooms with warmth and life. She also made friends in town, particularly with Mrs. Patterson, who became something of a mother figure to her. The older woman was thrilled about the baby and insisted on teaching Isla everything she knew about child rearing, knitting tiny booties and blankets in preparation for the new arrival. As Isla's pregnancy progressed, Thomas found his fears about fatherhood at his age gradually being replaced by excitement. He built a cradle with his own hands, using driftwood from the beach and polishing it until it gleamed. He read books about babies and child development, wanting to be prepared. He even practiced changing diapers on one of Isla's dolls, much to her amusement. One evening, about 6 months into the pregnancy, Thomas came home to find Isla sitting by the window, staring out at the harbor with a troubled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. Isla looked up at him, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "I've been thinking about what I told you, about my memories, about not knowing if I'm real." Thomas sat down beside her and took her hand. "You are real, Isla. I can feel your hand in mine. I can see you. I can hear you. You are real. But what about the baby?" Isla whispered. If I'm something else, something impossible, what does that make our child?" Thomas hadn't considered this. The implications of Isla's strange existence, whatever it might be, extending to their child. "I don't know," he admitted, "but does it matter? However this baby comes into the world, it will be ours. It will be loved. That's all that matters." "But what if?" Isla began, then stopped, seeming unable to articulate her fear. "What if what?" Thomas prompted gently. "What if I disappear?" Isla said, her voice breaking. "What if one day I wake up and realize this was all a dream? Or what if I was only meant to be here for a while and then I have to go back? Back to wherever I came from before I washed up on that beach." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. It was a fear he had pushed to the back of his mind, refusing to acknowledge. But now that Isla had spoken it aloud, he couldn't ignore it. "Then we'll face that when it comes," he said firmly. "But I refuse to live in fear of losing you, Isla. I did that after Eleanor died. I spent 10 years mourning, hiding, afraid to love again because I couldn't bear the thought of more loss. I won't do that now. I won't waste the time we have together worrying about when it might end." Isla looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "How did you get so wise?" "Years of practice," Thomas said with a small smile, "and a very persuasive wife." They sat together by the window, watching the sun set over the harbor, and Thomas silently promised himself that he would cherish every moment with Isla, every day they had together, for however long that might be. The baby came on a stormy night in March, 3 months after they had moved to Maryvale. Thomas had been at the harbor, ensuring all the boats were secure, when word reached him that Isla had gone into labor. He ran home through the rain, his heart pounding, terrified and excited in equal measure. Mrs. Patterson had already arrived and was with Isla, along with the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Brennan who had delivered half the babies in Maryvale. "She's doing fine," Mrs. Patterson assured Thomas as he burst through the door, soaking wet. "These things take time. Go change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Thomas changed quickly, then paced the sitting room, listening to the sounds from the bedroom. Isla's labored breathing, the murmured encouragement from the midwife and Mrs. Patterson, the occasional cry of pain that made his heart clench. It seemed to go on forever. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the cottage. Thomas found himself thinking of the night Isla had washed ashore, of the storm that had brought her to him. Was this storm bringing someone new into his life as well? Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard it, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. Thomas stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, until Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with a smile on her face. "Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore. You have a daughter, and she's perfect." Thomas stumbled into the bedroom to find Isla propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. When she saw him, her face lit up with pure joy. "Thomas, come meet your daughter," she said softly. Thomas approached the bed slowly, as if in a dream. Isla pulled back the blanket to reveal the smallest, most perfect face Thomas had ever seen. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and was making soft mewling sounds, her tiny fists waving in the air. Thomas couldn't find words. He sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out a finger to touch his daughter's impossibly small hand. Her fingers immediately curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "She's real," Isla whispered, and Thomas heard the relief and wonder in her voice. "She's solid. She's here." "Of course she is," Thomas said, though he understood what Isla meant. Despite all their reassurances to each other, there had been a part of both of them that wondered if a child conceived under such mysterious circumstances could truly exist. But here she was, perfect and real and utterly beautiful. "What should we name her?" Isla asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Hope," he said. "Her name should be Hope, because that's what she represents. Hope for the future. Hope for new beginnings. Hope that even in the darkest storms, light can still find a way to shine through." Isla smiled through her tears. Hope Eleanor Whitmore, after her father's late wife, who would have loved her. Thomas felt his own tears flowing freely now. "Eleanor would have adored her," he agreed. "And she would have been so happy that I found you, that I found love again." They sat together, the three of them, as the storm outside began to clear and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Thomas looked at his wife and his daughter and felt a sense of completeness he had never expected to feel again. Whatever mysteries surrounded Isla's past, whatever impossible circumstances had brought her into his life, this moment was real. This love was real. This family was real. That was all that mattered. Chapter 9, Years of Peace. The years that followed were the happiest of Thomas's life. Little Hope grew from a newborn into a curious, bright-eyed toddler, then into an energetic child full of questions and wonder. She had Isla's dark hair and Thomas's gray eyes, and a personality that was entirely her own, stubborn, adventurous, kind, and fiercely intelligent. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, perhaps a bit overprotective, but loving in every way. He taught Hope about the sea, about ships, about navigation and tides and weather. He read to her every night, sharing his love of books and stories. He carried her on his shoulders around the harbor, introducing her to the sailors and fishermen who had become his friends. Isla was a wonderful mother, patient and nurturing, but also firm when needed. She taught Hope to read and write, to cook and garden, to appreciate beauty in simple things. The cottage was always filled with music and laughter, with the smell of baking bread and the sound of Hope's giggles as Thomas chased her around the garden. The mystery of Isla's past gradually became just another part of their family's story. She never disappeared, never faded away, never showed any sign of being anything other than a normal woman. She aged naturally, developing fine lines around her eyes and threads of silver in her dark hair. If she had been something supernatural, some impossible being, she seemed to have become fully human through her love and her life with Thomas and Hope. But sometimes, late at night, Thomas would wake to find Isla standing at the window, looking out toward the lighthouse at Thornwick Point. It stood dark and empty now, slowly falling into disrepair. The lighthouse board had no plans for it, and it was too remote for anyone else to want it. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas would ask on those nights. "About where I came from," Isla would answer. "About whether I'll ever really know the truth. Does it matter?" Thomas would ask, though he knew it did, at least a little. "Sometimes I think it does," Isla would admit. "Sometimes I worry that one day I'll remember everything, and it will change who I am. Or worse, that I'll never remember, and I'll always have this feeling of incompleteness, this sense that part of my story is missing." "Your story isn't missing," Thomas would say, pulling her back to bed. "Your story is here with Hope and me. Whatever came before is just prologue. This is the real story." And Isla would smile and let him comfort her. But Thomas knew the question would never entirely leave her mind. When Hope was 5 years old, she announced that she wanted to visit the lighthouse where her father used to work. Thomas had told her stories about his years as a keeper, about the light that guided ships safely through the darkness, about the importance of the work he had done. Hope had listened with rapt attention, and now she wanted to see it for herself. Thomas was hesitant. He hadn't been back to Thornwick Point since the day he had turned off the light. The thought of seeing the lighthouse abandoned and empty filled him with sadness. But Hope was insistent, and Isla supported her, so Thomas finally agreed. They made the journey on a beautiful summer day, rowing out in Thomas's boat with a picnic lunch packed by Isla. As they approached the lighthouse, Thomas felt his heart begin to ache. It looked smaller than he remembered, and sad somehow, its white stone stained and weathered, windows dark and empty. They tied up the boat and climbed the path to the cottage. The door was locked, but Thomas still had his old key. The lock was rusty and it took several tries, but finally the door swung open. The cottage was exactly as they had left it, but covered in dust and showing signs of neglect. Some of the windows were cracked, and there was evidence of water damage where the roof had begun to leak. Thomas's heart broke a little at the sight. Hope, however, was fascinated. She ran from room to room, asking questions about everything: where her father had slept, where he had cooked his meals, what books he had read. Then she begged to see the lighthouse itself. The stairs were dangerous now, some of the treads rotted through, but Thomas led the way carefully, testing each step before allowing Hope to follow. Isla brought up the rear, holding Hope's hand. At the top, in the lamp room, Hope gasped in wonder. The great Fresnel lens was still there, dusty and unmaintained, but still magnificent. She pressed her face against the glass, looking out at the vast expanse of the sea. "You could see forever from here," she exclaimed. "That was the idea," Thomas said, ruffling her hair. "The lighthouse keeper's job was to watch, to be vigilant, to make sure no one was in danger. Like a guardian," Hope said thoughtfully. "Exactly like a guardian," Thomas agreed. They spent the afternoon at the lighthouse, having their picnic on the rocks where Thomas had found Isla all those years ago. Hope played at the edge of the water, collecting shells and sea glass, while Thomas and Isla sat together, holding hands. "Do you regret leaving?" Isla asked quietly. Thomas thought about it. Did he regret it? He missed the lighthouse, the solitude, the sense of purpose. But he looked at Hope, splashing in the tide pools and laughing with pure joy, and he looked at Isla beside him, and he knew the answer. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. This life, our life together, is more than I ever dreamed I would have again. The lighthouse was important, but it was never meant to be forever. I see that now. But it still meant something," Isla said. "It still means something." "It does," Thomas agreed. It always will. As they prepared to leave, Hope suddenly ran back to the lighthouse entrance. "Wait!" she called. "I want to do something." She disappeared inside, and they heard her footsteps echoing up the stairs. A moment later, she appeared in the lamp room, waving at them through the windows. Then she began to turn the lens by hand. It was still free to rotate, creating a slow, sweeping motion that caught the afternoon sun and sent flashes of light across the water. Thomas watched, transfixed. For a moment, it was as if the lighthouse was alive again, sending its message across the sea. "We are here. We are watching. We will keep you safe." Hope came running back down, breathless and excited. Did you see the light?" "We saw it, sweetheart," Isla said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "It was beautiful." As they rowed back to Maryvale, Hope fell asleep in the bow of the boat, exhausted from the day's adventures. Thomas and Isla sat together in comfortable silence, watching the lighthouse recede into the distance. "She's special, isn't she?" Isla said softly. "Hope, there's something about her. Something extraordinary." "All children are extraordinary to their parents," Thomas said, but he knew what Isla meant. There was something about Hope, a light in her that seemed to shine from within, a compassion and wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "I wonder if she inherited it from me," Isla mused. "Whatever I am, whatever made me possible. Does it matter?" Thomas asked, echoing their frequent refrain. "Maybe not," Isla admitted, "but I can't help wondering. If I'm something impossible, and she came from me, what does that make her? What is she capable of?" "Anything," Thomas said firmly. "She's capable of anything, not because of some supernatural inheritance, but because she's loved and brave and curious. That's all any child needs to be extraordinary." Isla smiled and leaned against him. "You're right, as always." "Not always," Thomas protested, "but occasionally." They laughed together, and Hope stirred in her sleep, smiling at some dream. Behind them, the lighthouse stood silent on its rocky point, a monument to the past but no longer a light for the future. That role, Thomas realized, had been passed on. To Hope, to the next generation, to the future that stretched out before them, unknown but no longer frightening. Chapter 10. The Storm Returns. Hope was 12 years old when the great storm came. It was the worst storm anyone in Maryvale could remember, worse even than the one that had brought Isla to Thornwick Point all those years ago. For 3 days, the wind howled and the rain lashed down, and the sea rose to terrifying heights. Thomas, as harbormaster, worked around the clock to keep everyone safe. The harbor was crowded with vessels seeking shelter, and all had to be properly secured, their crews accounted for, emergency supplies distributed. He barely slept, snatching only brief moments of rest between crises. On the 3rd day of the storm, word came that a ship was in trouble. A cargo vessel called the Northern Star had been driven off course and was now dangerously close to the rocks near Thornwick Point. The Coast Guard had been alerted, but the conditions were too rough for them to launch. The ship and its crew of 16 were on their own. Thomas listened to the reports coming in over the radio with growing dread. Without the lighthouse to warn them, the Northern Star's captain might not realize how close he was to the rocks until it was too late. The ship's modern navigation equipment was malfunctioning, damaged by the storm, and they were navigating blind. "Someone needs to get to the lighthouse," Thomas said. "Someone needs to light it." "That's impossible," Captain Morris of the Coast Guard said. "The lighthouse is decommissioned. It hasn't been maintained in years. Even if you could get there in this storm, there's no guarantee the equipment would work." "But we have to try," Thomas insisted. Those people will die if we don't. Thomas, you're not a young man anymore, Captain Morris said, not unkindly. You're 62 years old, going out in the storm, trying to reach Thornwick Point, climbing those stairs in that deteriorating structure. It's suicide. Then let me go, Isla said. Everyone turned to look at her. She had come to the harbor office to bring Thomas food and dry clothes, and had been listening to the conversation. Absolutely not, Thomas said immediately. Isla, you can't. I can, Isla interrupted. Thomas, think about it. You've taught me everything about the lighthouse, about how it works, how to maintain it. I'm younger, stronger. I can make it. No, Thomas said flatly. I won't risk losing you. And I won't stand by and watch 16 people die when I can do something to save them. Isla shot back. Thomas, this is what you taught me. This is what you spent 30 years doing. Saving lives, being the light in the darkness. Let me carry on that tradition. Your mother's right, Dad. Thomas turned to see Hope standing in the doorway. She must have followed Isla to the harbor. She was soaked through from the rain, but her eyes were bright and determined. Hope, this doesn't concern you, Thomas began. It does concern me, Hope interrupted. Those are people out there, people who need help, and we can help them. Mom and I. What do you mean, Mom and I? Thomas demanded. I'm coming too, Hope said simply. You've been taking me to the lighthouse since I was 5. I know every step, every room, every part of the mechanism. And I'm smaller and lighter than either of you. I can get through places you can't, fix things you can't reach. This is insane, Thomas said, looking between his wife and daughter. Both of you are insane. I'm not letting either of you risk your lives. It's not your decision to make, Isla said gently. Thomas, you've spent your whole life saving people. You've saved me. Now let us save someone else. Let us honor what you taught us. Thomas looked around the room at the assembled faces. Captain Morris, the Coast Guard crew, various fishermen and sailors who had gathered to monitor the storm. They were all watching him, waiting to see what he would decide. But he knew deep down that it wasn't his decision. Isla and Hope were their own people with their own agency, their own courage. He couldn't protect them by keeping them locked away. He could only trust them, believe in them, and support them. If you're going, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, then I'm going with you. Thomas, Isla began.
No, Thomas interrupted.
I won't let you do this alone. If this is to be done, we do it together. As a family. Isla looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Together. Within an hour, they were ready. Thomas had assembled supplies, oil for the lamp, tools for any necessary repairs, ropes, and safety equipment. Captain Morris had provided them with life jackets and a radio. The plan was simple. They would take Thomas's boat to Thornwick Point, get to the lamp room, and light the lighthouse. Once the Northern Star was safely past the rocks, they would return to Maryvale. Simple, but almost certainly impossible. The journey to Thornwick Point was terrifying. The waves were mountainous, tossing their small boat around like a toy. Thomas had to use every ounce of his skill and experience to keep them on course, to prevent them from capsizing or being dashed against the rocks. Isla and Hope bailed water continuously, working together with a synchronicity born of years of teamwork. When they finally reached the lighthouse, Thomas realized that getting the boat secured was going to be its own challenge. The usual mooring was under several feet of surging water. He had to navigate to a small rocky outcrop and tie the boat to an iron ring that had been set there generations ago. The climb from the boat to the lighthouse took all 3 of them working together. Thomas went first, securing ropes for Isla and Hope to follow. The rain was blinding, the wind was deafening, and every surface was slick and treacherous. But they persevered, pulling themselves up foot by foot, until finally they reached the cottage door. Inside, out of the immediate fury of the storm, they took a moment to catch their breath. The cottage was in worse shape than when they had visited years ago. Part of the roof had caved in, and water was pouring through in several places. But the structure was still sound enough to provide shelter. "The lighthouse," Thomas said, gathering up their supplies. "Let's go." The stairs were even more dangerous than Thomas had feared. Several treads had rotted completely through, forcing them to jump gaps. The handrail was loose in places, threatening to give way. But they climbed carefully, testing each step, helping each other over the worst spots. At the top, in the lamp room, they found a disaster. Water had leaked in through the cracked windows, damaging some of the equipment. The lens was covered in a thick layer of grime and salt. The oil reservoir for the lamp was bone dry. "Can we fix it?" Isla asked, already beginning to clean the lens with a cloth she had brought. Thomas examined the mechanism with a critical eye. "Maybe. The motor that turns the lens is seized. We'll have to turn it manually, and we'll need to refuel the lamp. But yes, I think we can get it working." They set to work with frantic efficiency. Thomas and Hope worked on the mechanism while Isla cleaned the lens. They had brought oil, and Thomas carefully refilled the reservoir, his hands shaking. From cold or fear or age, he wasn't sure. Over the radio, they could hear reports of the Northern Star's position. The ship was getting closer to the rocks, closer to disaster, completely unaware of the danger they were in. "Hurry!" Captain Morris's voice crackled over the radio. "They're less than a mile from the rocks now. If you can't get that light working in the next few minutes..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Almost there," Thomas muttered, making the final adjustments to the lamp. "Hope, is the lens ready?" "Clean as I can get it," Hope called back. "Isla." "Mechanism is free," Isla confirmed. "We can turn it manually." "All right," Thomas said, taking a deep breath. "Let's light this light." He struck a match. His hands were trembling so badly it took 3 tries, and touched it to the wick. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the flame caught and began to grow. Thomas adjusted the lamp, nursing the flame, coaxing it brighter. It seemed to take forever, but finally the lamp was burning at full strength. The Fresnel lens magnified and focused the light into a powerful beam. "Now!" Thomas shouted. "Turn the lens." Isla and Hope grabbed the handles on either side of the lens mechanism and began to turn. It was heavy, resistant from years of disuse, but they strained against it until finally it began to move. The beam began to rotate, sweeping across the water, cutting through the storm. Over the radio, they heard a crackle of excitement from the Northern Star. "We see it. We see the lighthouse, altering course now." Thomas, Isla, and Hope continued to turn the lens, their muscles screaming with the effort, sweat mixing with rain on their faces. But they kept going, kept the light turning, kept the beam sweeping across the darkness. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, Captain Morris's voice came over the radio. "The Northern Star is clear. They've passed the rocks. They're safe." Thomas, Isla, and Hope collapsed against the lens mechanism, exhausted but triumphant. They had done it. Together, they had saved 16 lives. "We should put the light out," Isla said after a moment. "Save the oil." "No," Hope said suddenly. "Leave it on, at least for tonight, in case anyone else needs it." Thomas looked at his daughter, at this remarkable young woman who understood instinctively what the lighthouse represented. Not just a tool, but a symbol. A promise that someone was watching, Someone cared. Someone would guide you home. Leave it on, Thomas agreed. For tonight, Thornwick Point Lighthouse is back in service. They spent the night in the lamp room, taking turns manually rotating the lens, keeping the light burning. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and bright. The Northern Star and its crew had made it safely to Maryvale Harbor. As they prepared to leave, Hope stopped at the door and looked back at the lamp room. "This place should never have been closed," she said. "It's too important." "It's the past, sweetheart," Thomas said gently. "The world has moved on." "Maybe the world moved on too quickly," Hope replied. "Maybe some things from the past are worth preserving, worth fighting for." Thomas looked at Isla and saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Their daughter was right. The lighthouse had proven its worth last night. It had saved lives again, just as it had for over a century. Maybe it didn't need to stay in the past. Chapter 11. The Campaign. Word of what the Whitmore family had done spread quickly through the coastal towns. The story of the decommissioned lighthouse being relit, of a family risking their lives to save strangers, captured people's imaginations. Newspapers picked up the story. The Northern Star's captain and crew publicly thanked Thomas, Isla, and Hope, crediting them with saving their lives. But it was Hope who saw beyond the moment of heroism to the larger question. Why had the lighthouse been decommissioned in the first place? Why had maritime authorities decided that a piece of equipment that could still save lives was no longer necessary? She was 15 now, bright and determined, with her father's sense of duty and her mother's fierce compassion. She began researching lighthouse decommissioning across the country, writing letters to officials, gathering data about maritime accidents in areas where lighthouses had been closed. What she discovered was alarming. While it was true that modern navigation equipment was very good, it was not infallible. Equipment could fail. Storms could damage electronic systems. And when that happened, ships were left vulnerable, especially in areas with dangerous coastlines like Thornwick Point. Hope presented her findings to her parents over dinner one evening. She had spreadsheets, charts, statistics, and a proposal. They should campaign to have Thornwick Point Lighthouse officially recommissioned. "It's a wonderful idea," Isla said. "But Hope, these things are complicated. There are budget concerns, liability issues, bureaucratic red tape. It's not just a matter of showing that lighthouses are useful." "Then we'll address all of those concerns," Hope said firmly. "Dad, you know how to run a lighthouse. You did it for 30 years. You could do it again." Thomas felt a flutter in his chest at the thought. Return to the lighthouse? Resume his old life, his old purpose? It was tempting, achingly so. But he was 65 now, not as strong as he used to be, and he had responsibilities in Maryvale. "I'm retired, Hope," he said gently. "I'm the harbor master. That's my job now." "Then I'll do it," Hope said. Thomas and Isla stared at their daughter. "You'll do it," Thomas repeated. "Hope, you're 15 years old. You're still in school." "I'll be 18 in 3 years," Hope pointed out. "By the time we navigate all the bureaucracy and get the lighthouse recommissioned, if we can get it recommissioned, I'll be old enough to be certified as a keeper. You can teach me everything I need to know." "Hope," Isla said carefully, "being a lighthouse keeper is a solitary, difficult life. You'd be isolated, cut off from friends your age, from normal social activities. Mom, when have I ever been interested in normal social activities?" Hope asked. "I'd rather spend time with my books and the sea than at dances or parties. And I wouldn't be completely isolated. You and Dad could visit. I could come to town occasionally. And someone needs to do this. Someone needs to prove that lighthouses still matter." Thomas looked at his daughter and saw himself at her age, idealistic, passionate, determined to make a difference. He also saw Isla in her, the stubborn courage, the refusal to accept the world as it was if it could be made better. "Even if we agreed to support you in this," Thomas said slowly, "it would be a long shot. The lighthouse board would need to be convinced. Funding would need to be secured. The lighthouse itself would need extensive repairs. It could take years, and it might not happen at all. Then we'd better get started," Hope said with a smile. The campaign to recommission Thornwick Point Lighthouse began that week. Hope, with her parents' support, started a petition that quickly gathered thousands of signatures. She gave talks at schools and community centers about the importance of maintaining traditional navigation aids alongside modern technology. She wrote op-eds for local newspapers and gave interviews to journalists who were captivated by the teenage girl fighting to preserve a piece of maritime history. Thomas found himself drawn back into the world of lighthouses, consulting with Hope on technical matters, helping her understand the intricacies of lighthouse operations. It rekindled something in him, a spark that he had thought was extinguished. He realized how much he had missed it, not just the lighthouse itself, but the sense of purpose it had given him. Isla threw herself into the campaign as well, organizing fundraisers and community events, reaching out to maritime organizations and historical societies. She proved to be a brilliant organizer, able to coordinate complex efforts and bring people together around a common cause. 2 years into the campaign, they had their first major breakthrough. A wealthy philanthropist who had been saved by a lighthouse keeper in his youth donated a substantial sum toward the restoration of Thornwick Point. With that money, they were able to begin repairs on the structure, fixing the roof, replacing damaged stairs, and restoring the lamp mechanism. Hope turned 17 and took her exams to become a certified lighthouse keeper, the youngest person in the country to do so. Thomas helped her study, feeling a surge of pride every time she mastered a new skill or demonstrated her understanding of lighthouse operations. The lighthouse board remained resistant, but the growing public support for the project, combined with the backing of several influential maritime organizations, slowly wore down their objections. Finally, 3 years after the storm that had brought them back to Thornwick Point, they received word. The Lighthouse Board had agreed to recommission the lighthouse on a trial basis. If it proved its value over a 2-year period, it would be permanently restored to active service. Hope was 18 now, officially certified, and ready to take up the position of keeper. There was a ceremony, nothing elaborate, just a gathering of family, friends, and supporters at the lighthouse on a bright summer day. The mayor of Maryvale gave a speech. The captain of the Northern Star, whose life Hope had helped save all those years ago, presented her with a plaque of appreciation. But the most meaningful moment came when Thomas handed Hope the key to the lighthouse. It was the same key he had used for 30 years, worn smooth by his hand, a physical link between the past and the future. "Your lighthouse," he said simply. "Our lighthouse," Hope corrected, closing her fingers around the key. "This belongs to all of us, to everyone who fought to preserve it, to everyone who understands what it represents." That evening, as the sun set, Hope climbed the stairs of Thornwick Point Lighthouse for the first time as its official keeper. Thomas and Isla stood at the bottom, watching as lights began to appear in the windows above. First in the cottage, then in the lamp room itself. And then, for the first time in over a decade, the beam of Thornwick Point Lighthouse swept across the water, announcing to all who could see it, "We are here. We are watching. We will keep you safe." Thomas felt tears on his cheeks and realized Isla was crying too. "She did it," Isla whispered. "Our daughter did it. We all did it," Thomas corrected. Together, they stood there holding hands, watching the light, and Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that stormy night when he had found a mysterious woman on the beach, through their years of love and family, to this moment when their daughter was continuing a tradition that went back over a century. It wasn't the ending he had expected when the lighthouse was first decommissioned all those years ago. But it was a better ending, he realized. Not an ending at all, really. A continuation, a renewal, a passing of the light from one generation to the next. Chapter 12, Full Circle. 5 years passed. Hope proved to be an excellent lighthouse keeper, even better than Thomas had been. She modernized the operations while respecting tradition, implementing new safety procedures while maintaining the time-honored routines of lighthouse keeping. The trial period ended with glowing reports, and Thornwick Point Lighthouse was permanently recommissioned. But during those 5 years, Thomas had been slowing down. The years of hard work, the stresses of his various careers, and simple age had taken their toll. He was 70 now, and though his mind was still sharp, his body was failing. He had good days and bad days, and the bad days were becoming more frequent. One autumn evening, on one of his good days, he asked Isla to row him out to Thornwick Point. Hope was expecting them. Thomas had called ahead and had prepared a special dinner. It had become their tradition to gather at the lighthouse once a month, to share a meal and maintain their family connection despite the physical distance. The dinner was lovely, filled with laughter and good food and easy conversation. Hope told them about the ships she had guided safely through recent storms, about the improvements she had made to the lighthouse, about her plans for the future. She was 23 now, confident and capable, and Thomas felt immense pride watching her. After dinner, Thomas asked if he could climb to the lamproom one last time. Hope and Isla exchanged worried glances. The stairs were difficult even for someone in good health, but Thomas was insistent. "I need to see it," he said. "I need to stand up there one more time." So they helped him climb, slowly and carefully, taking frequent rests. By the time they reached the top, Thomas was exhausted but exhilarated. The view was just as he remembered. The vast expanse of the sea, the rocky coastline, the distant lights of Maryvale twinkling in the gathering darkness. "Thank you," Thomas said, looking at Hope, "for bringing the light back, for understanding what this place means. You taught me that," Hope said, her eyes shining. "Everything I know about duty, about service, about the importance of being a light in the darkness. I learned from you. And from your mother," Thomas added, taking Isla's hand. "She's the one who taught me to live again, to love again, to have hope when I thought hope was impossible." They stood together in the lamproom as night fell and the light came on, its beams sweeping across the water. Thomas felt at peace, complete, as if he had come full circle. He had started his journey as a lighthouse keeper, had lost that identity for a time, but had ultimately passed it on to his daughter. The light would continue long after he was gone. "There's something I need to tell you both," Isla said suddenly. "Something I should have said years ago, but I was afraid." Thomas and Hope turned to look at her. "I remember now," Isla continued, her voice soft. "I remember everything, the real truth of what happened to me." Thomas felt his heart begin to race. After all these years, was Isla finally going to explain the mystery of her existence? "I was on the Arabella," Isla said, "the ship that sank 20 years before I washed up on the beach. I was 8 years old, and I drowned when the ship went down. I remember the water closing over my head, the cold, the darkness, the certainty that I was dying." "Isla," Thomas began, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. When I died, I didn't go wherever people usually go. I was caught somehow, trapped between life and death. I existed in a kind of limbo, conscious but not really alive, unable to move on but unable to return to the world either. It was horrible, Thomas. 20 years of being alone in the dark, unable to speak or move or do anything but exist. Tears were streaming down Isla's face now. Hope had moved to her mother's side, holding her hand. But then there was another storm, Isla continued. The storm that you saved those fishermen from, Thomas. That storm somehow shook me loose from wherever I had been trapped. It gave me a second chance. I washed up on the beach, and you found me, and I was alive again. Really alive. Not 8 years old anymore, but the age I would have been if I had lived all those years. 28. Why didn't you tell us this before? Hope asked gently. Because I was afraid, Isla admitted. Afraid that if I acknowledged what I was, something that shouldn't exist, something impossible, I would disappear. Or that you would think I was crazy. Or that knowing the truth would change how you felt about me. So I pretended not to remember, pretended to be uncertain, when really I knew all along. Thomas pulled Isla into his arms, holding her close. It doesn't change anything, he said firmly. You're my wife, the mother of my daughter, the love of my life. I don't care how you came to be here. I'm just grateful that you are. But don't you see? Isla said, pulling back to look at him. I was given a second chance at life. A chance to live the years that were stolen from me, to grow up, to fall in love, to have a family. You gave me that, Thomas. You saved me in more ways than you know. And you saved me, Thomas replied. I was drowning too in grief and loneliness and despair. You pulled me back to life just as surely as I pulled you from the water. They held each other, and Hope stood beside them, her hand on her mother's shoulder. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, casting its light across the water, and Thomas felt the pieces of his life finally clicking into place. He had been a lighthouse keeper, guiding ships safely through dangerous waters. He had been a husband to Eleanor, learning what it meant to love someone completely. He had been a widower, learning what it meant to lose and to grieve. He had been a hermit, hiding from the world in his pain. And then Isla had arrived, impossible and miraculous, and he had become a husband again, and a father, and had learned that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. That love can come more than once. That second chances are real. I'm tired, Thomas said eventually. I think I'd like to rest. They helped him down the stairs and settled him in Hope's bedroom. Isla sat beside him, holding his hand, while Hope prepared tea in the kitchen. Thomas could hear her moving about, humming softly to herself, and he smiled. His daughter was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Do you remember? Thomas said to Isla. The night I found you? You were lying on the beach, and I thought at first you were just debris from the storm. But then I realized you were alive. I remember, Isla said. I remember opening my eyes and seeing your face. You looked so worried, so determined to help. I felt safe immediately, even though I didn't know where I was or what had happened. I carried you back to the cottage, Thomas continued. You weighed almost nothing. You were so cold. I was terrified you wouldn't make it. But I did make it, Isla said. Because of you. We both made it, Thomas corrected. We saved each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of the waves and the wind and the lighthouse mechanism above them. Thomas felt himself drifting, not quite asleep but not fully awake either. Isla, he murmured. I'm here, she assured him. Thank you for staying, for choosing to be real, to be here, to be mine. Always, Isla whispered. For as long as I exist, I'm yours. Thomas smiled and let himself drift further. He could hear Hope returning with the tea, could feel Isla's hand warm in his. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, and he imagined he could see Eleanor's face in the light, smiling, approving, at peace with the life he had built after her. Epilogue. The light continues. Thomas Whitmore died peacefully in his sleep that night, in the lighthouse he loved, surrounded by his family. He was 70 years old, and he left behind a wife who loved him, a daughter who honored him, and a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. The funeral was held in Maryvale, attended by seemingly everyone in the coastal communities. Sailors and fishermen came to pay their respects to the man who had guided them safely for so many years. The captain of the Northern Star gave a eulogy, speaking of the night Thomas and his family had saved his life and the lives of his crew. But it was Hope who spoke last, standing before the gathered crowd with her mother beside her, and told them about her father, not just the lighthouse keeper, but the man, the widower who had learned to love again, the hermit who had opened his, holding Hope's hand. At the top, in the lamp room, Hope gasped in wonder. The great Fresnel lens was still there, dusty and unmaintained, but still magnificent. She pressed her face against the glass, looking out at the vast expanse of the sea. "You could see forever from here," she exclaimed. "That was the idea," Thomas said, ruffling her hair. The lighthouse keeper's job was to watch, to be vigilant, to make sure no one was in danger. "Like a guardian," Hope said thoughtfully. "Exactly like a guardian," Thomas agreed. They spent the afternoon at the lighthouse, having their picnic on the rocks where Thomas had found Isla all those years ago. Hope played at the edge of the water, collecting shells and sea glass, while Thomas and Isla sat together, holding hands. "Do you regret leaving?" Isla asked quietly. Thomas thought about it. Did he regret it? He missed the lighthouse, the solitude, the sense of purpose. But he looked at Hope, splashing in the tide pools and laughing with pure joy, and he looked at Isla beside him, and he knew the answer. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. This life, our life together, is more than I ever dreamed I would have again. The lighthouse was important, but it was never meant to be forever. I see that now. But it still meant something," Isla said. "It still means something." "It does," Thomas agreed. "It always will." As they prepared to leave, Hope suddenly ran back to the lighthouse entrance. "Wait," she called. "I want to do something." She disappeared inside, and they heard her footsteps echoing up the stairs. A moment later, she appeared in the lamp room, waving at them through the windows. Then she began to turn the lens by hand. It was still free to rotate, creating a slow, sweeping motion that caught the afternoon sun and sent flashes of light across the water. Thomas watched, transfixed. For a moment, it was as if the lighthouse was alive again, sending its message across the sea. "We are here. We are watching. We will keep you safe." Hope came running back down, breathless and excited. Did you see the light?" "We saw it, sweetheart," Isla said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "It was beautiful." As they rowed back to Maryvale, Hope fell asleep in the bow of the boat, exhausted from the day's adventures. Thomas and Isla sat together in comfortable silence, watching the lighthouse recede into the distance. "She's special, isn't she?" Isla said softly. "Hope, there's something about her. Something extraordinary." "All children are extraordinary to their parents," Thomas said, but he knew what Isla meant. There was something about Hope, a light in her that seemed to shine from within, a compassion and wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "I wonder if she inherited it from me," Isla mused. "Whatever I am, whatever made me possible. Does it matter?" Thomas asked, echoing their frequent refrain. "Maybe not," Isla admitted, "but I can't help wondering. If I'm something impossible, and she came from me, what does that make her? What is she capable of?" "Anything," Thomas said firmly. "She's capable of anything." not because of some supernatural inheritance, but because she's loved and brave and curious. That's all any child needs to be extraordinary. Isla smiled and leaned against him. You're right, as always. Not always, Thomas protested, but occasionally. They laughed together, and hope stirred in her sleep, smiling at some dream. Behind them, the lighthouse stood silent on its rocky point, a monument to the past but no longer a light for the future. That role, Thomas realized, had been passed on. To hope, to the next generation, to the future that stretched out before them, unknown but no longer frightening. Chapter 10. The Storm Returns. Hope was 12 years old when the great storm came. It was the worst storm anyone in Maryvale could remember. Worse even than the one that had brought Isla to Thornwick. It was quietly, in her sleep, with a smile on her face. At her funeral, they told stories about the mysterious woman who had washed ashore, about the lighthouse keeper who had saved her, about the love that had grown between them, about the family they had built. Some of the stories had taken on the quality of legend, embellished and enhanced over the years, but the core truth remained. Two people had found each other against all odds and had created something beautiful together. Hope inherited her mother's journals. Isla had written extensively about her experiences, about her memories, about her theories on how and why she had been given a second chance. Reading them, Hope was struck by her mother's wisdom, her gratitude, her deep understanding of what it meant to be alive. The last entry was dated the day before Isla died. It was brief. I have lived two lives, one short and tragic, one long and beautiful. I have been dead and alive, lost and found, alone and loved. I have been given gifts I never could have imagined. A husband who saw past the impossibility of my existence to the person I was. A daughter who has surpassed every dream I had for her. Grandchildren who carry our light into the future. If I am called back to whatever realm I came from, I go gladly, with no regrets, with a heart full of gratitude. But I also go with hope. Hope that death is not the end, that love transcends even the boundaries between worlds, that somewhere, somehow, Thomas is waiting for me. And if not, if this truly is the end, then I am content knowing that I used my second chance well. I lived, I loved, I mattered. That is all anyone can ask for. Hope closed the journal with tears streaming down her face. Then she climbed the lighthouse stairs, as she did every evening, to tend to the light. Her son Thomas came with her. He was 12 now, old enough to begin learning the family trade. Grandmother Isla was special, wasn't she? Young Thomas asked as they worked. Very special, Hope agreed. Do you think her story was true? About dying and coming back? Hope considered the question. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. Does it matter? I guess not, Thomas said thoughtfully. Even if she was just a normal person who lost her memory, the important part is what happened after. How she and grandfather found each other. How they built a life together. How they saved people, including those sailors in the storm. Exactly, Hope said, feeling proud of her son's insight. The mystery of where someone comes from is less important than where they choose to go. Your grandmother chose to stay here, to love us, to be part of this family. That's what matters. They finished preparing the light and stepped back as it ignited and began its rotation. Hope never tired of this moment. The instant when the darkness was pushed back, when the light blazed forth, when the promise was renewed. We are here. We are watching. We will keep you safe. Mom, Thomas asked, when I'm old enough, can I be the lighthouse keeper? After you. Hope smiled and put her arm around her son. If that's what you want, if you understand what it means. It's not just a job, Thomas. It's a calling, a commitment to be there for others, to guide them, to keep them safe even when it's difficult or dangerous or lonely. I understand, Thomas said seriously. Grandfather Thomas taught you, and you'll teach me, and someday I'll teach my children. The light will keep going. The light will keep going, Hope agreed. And it did. Generations later, the lighthouse at Thornwick Point still stands, still operates, still guides ships safely through dangerous waters. The Whitmore family still tends to it, passing the knowledge and the responsibility from parent to child, keeping alive a tradition that goes back over 2 centuries. Tourists come to visit sometimes, to see the historic lighthouse, to hear the stories about the keeper who saved a mysterious woman from the sea, about the family that fought to preserve the light. Some of the stories have become exaggerated over time. People claim to see ghosts in the lighthouse, or say that Isla was a mermaid, or insist that Thomas could communicate with the sea itself. But those who know the real story, the keepers, the family, those who understand, know that the truth is both simpler and more profound than any legend. Thomas and Isla were just 2 people who found each other, loved each other, and built a life together. They saved people, they raised a daughter, they made a difference in the world. And every night, the light continues to shine, a testament to their love, their courage, and their belief that in a dark and uncertain world, one person or one light can make all the difference. The beam sweeps across the water, again and again, endless and eternal, a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, a light that will never go out as long as there are those who believe in its purpose. We are here. We are watching. We will keep you safe. The end.